actually, when Dinesh asked me to speak on the amendments to the finance bill, I had just glanced through. I knew that, okay, 45.4, 45.4A, those changes were there, but I had not really looked at, what were the small changes here and there. And so I told Dinesh, Dinesh, why do you want to, me to speak on this subject, and that too for 2 hours? They said, no, no, sir, you spoke on the finance bill, so why don't you this thing, etc. And then finally I agreed. And I was happy that I agreed, because when you look at it, you realize, so many nuances, so many aspects. And in fact, I think on this taxation of partnership firms, Anish did mention that, this was, it's undergone a complete change. Anish, have a slightly different view, because, there were at least 8 to 10 interpretations of how 45.4 and 45.4A, as they were introduced, was to be interpreted. And one of the interpretations which we had taken at that point of time was that, yes, one provision is to tax the partner's gain which he makes, and one is to tax the capital gain which the firms makes. And that is ultimately what has come about, I think, in a sense. So out of those 9 or 10 interpretations, this one has proven to be justified. Of course, it was very badly drafted, and therefore I think it was absolutely essential that some clarity be brought about in that. Thankfully there is some clarity, but I think, frankly speaking, the amount of issues which this will raise, I think you can have a whole seminar on just on now on taxation of partnership firms, on this withdrawal, and so there are, and in fact, the major part of my talk also is going to be on that, the various issues which come up. And so let's look at how that will play out. And of course, uh, this is, I think, the first time that people, of course, do refer to it that there are more than 100 changes, 100 clauses. But let me just say that out of these 100 clauses, a lot of these, 100 and odd clauses, many of those clauses relate to fortunately, to the LIC amendments to the LIC Act. So if you look at the direct tax clauses, there are around 68 amendments to the Tax Act, 67 rather to the Income Tax Act, two to the equalization levy provisions, and there is one amendment to that extension and odd amendment act, the act which changed in middle of the year. It did change the so that's the position. So I think what I will do is I will also maybe just while I'm talking, maybe I will switch off my video also, so that I think you can just hear me rather than and let's look at the various clauses now. So at the end, if you have any questions, let's leave them to the end. I will leave around 10 minutes for any questions that you may have on the subject. Particularly, as
Gautam, just a second. I just want to tell the participants that please put your questions only in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Thank you. Sorry, Gautam. Go ahead.
Yeah, that will be great. Okay, so let's look at the First Amendment. The First Amendment was in this, this de definition of liable to tax, which was inserted, was proposed to be inserted by the Finance Bill by the insertion of a new section, clause 29A to section 2, with effect from assessment year 21-22. And the original definition, it said that liable to tax means that there is liability on such person under any law for the time being enforced in any country, and shall include a case where subsequent to imposition of tax liability and exemption has been provided. Now, this was fairly, wide, and particularly if you were to use this definition in the context of a treaty, it would have given a very, sometimes a ridiculous position. And therefore, now they have narrowed down this definition, and they've said that liable to tax and with reference to a particular country means that there's an income tax liability, not just and not any law. So on such person under the law of that country for the time being in force, and shall include a person who has subsequently been exempted from such liability under the laws of that country. So now it is specific that it is to be looked at vis-a-vis that particular country, and it has to be looked at vis-a-vis the Income Tax Act and not any other law. Because earlier, the view was that perhaps other liabilities, also GST liability, VAT liability, etc., that may also have triggered the, it could have been regarded as liable to tax in that country, and therefore this amendment was something which was, I think, it's something which was necessary, and it has been fortunately done. This definition, of course, you would say that, oh, liable to tax means it's fairly still. That means if I'm, this income tax liability is not there. I think you have to read it also, that it's not just that you're not liable to tax in those countries that you become this, that if you look at the definition under section 6, I mean, under the definition of under 6(1)(a), so it has to be read in conjunction with that. That's one very important thing, I think, which people tend to miss out. Because 6(1)(a) says that he is not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of his domicile or residence or any other criteria of similar nature. So that is important, so it has to be by reason of domicile, residence, or any other criteria of similar nature. So therefore, people say that, oh, what if he's liable to tax because of the source of income being in that country? He's liable to tax. But then you have to import that liability tax into the definition under 6(1)(a) and then see whether you fit in within that. Is it by virtue of domicile, residence? Is it by virtue of that? And if not, then possibly, or a similar nature. If not, then it's just, if it is a source-based taxation, you would still not become a resident of India for that purpose. Whether this would be applicable to double taxation avoidance agreements, I think yes, this seems to be because of the fact that most double taxation avoidance agreements do have a provision saying that where a term is not defined under the treaties, then it would get its source from the domestic tax law. So if you're looking at India-US treaty, for instance, you would apply this because so far as India is concerned, they would apply the domestic law provisions to that because that has to be read then along with the treaty. But this still does not resolve the problem which this amendment has created. The last year's amendment has created, so far as a fiscally transparent entity is concerned. When you import this into the treaties, so for instance, what I mean by fiscally transparent entity, I mean an entity like a partnership firm, which in many countries, a partnership firm is not taxed as a partnership firm, unlike as in India. In India, a partnership firm is taxed as a separate taxable entity. In many countries around the world, in fact, I would say in most countries around the world, a partnership firm is regarded as an entity which is like a pass-through entity. It is not regarded as, the partnership firm is not taxed, but it is the partners who are taxed in respect of their share of income from the partnership firm. So therefore, it is what we call as a fiscally transparent entity. There, it's not the entity which is liable to tax, but the members are liable to tax. And therefore, you could have a situation where India looks at the partnership firm and, says, oh, the partnership firm is not liable to tax in the country, though the partners may be liable. But there, I think, one has to then apply the OECD, the hybrid entity guidelines, etc., which are there as part of the OECD commentary, where they say that you look at, then you look at the partners, then to apply the treaty, get the treaty benefit, it should be available. But that is an area which still remains sometimes an area of dispute. Now, the other aspect is that this will still, cover a situation where, so as I said, where you have a tax treaty, there is no problem. Say, for instance, the worry was, what about residents of the UAE? Now, so far as residents of the UAE are concerned, I think still there is no area of concern because the UAE, though it does not have a domestic tax law, and you may not be liable to tax otherwise, but they do issue tax residency certificates, and the India-UAE double taxation avoidance agreement does have a provision, does have a definition of who is a resident of that country, and there, fortunately, I think you have. It is based on the number of days stay in the UAE. If you're in UAE for more than 182 days, you are regarded as a resident of the UAE, and the UAE authorities do issue a tax residency certificate. So if you have a tax residency certificate, you don't have to worry. The problem really is in non-treaty, where there are countries which have no income tax laws, such as Oman or Qatar, etc. So these are the problem countries where there may be an issue, because though you may be residing in that country, because there is no tax law, you're not liable to tax therein, and you may be still a citizen of India, and therefore you may become liable to tax. I mean, you may become a resident of India by virtue of the fact that you're not liable to tax in any other country under the tax laws of that country. So this is so far as the concept of residence of liable to tax is concerned. Then so far as ULIPs are concerned, as you know, the ULIPs, certain high value ULIPs where the premium exceeds 2,50,000 unit-linked insurance policies issued by insurers, life insurance policies, which are linked to units, so there, if the premium for any of the years exceeds 2,50,000, one or more policies issued after 1st February 2021, they said that you will not get the exemption which is there for life insurance policies under section 1010D. So that exemption would not be available. There was an amendment which was made to expression to 112A, and that was the definition of equity-oriented mutual fund. And they said that ULIPs which are not exempt under Section 1010 due to this fourth and fifth proviso which have been added, this will be fall under, this will be eligible as a unit equity-oriented mutual fund. So that was the amendment which was proposed. And there, clause A2 of the exposition of to 112A would also have to be fulfilled, and that provides that 65% of total proceeds of such funds are invested in equity shares of the listed domestic company, or 90% is invested in a fund which invests 90% in equities, a fund of funds as we call it, in that sense. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to bring ULIPs on par with equity-oriented mutual funds, so that effectively what happens is that if a ULIP is held for more than 1 year, because the holding period would be 1 year. If it's held for more than 1 year, it would be classified as long-term capital gain. If it's held for less than a year, it would be classified as short-term capital gain. But still, by virtue of it being an equity-oriented mutual fund, because Section 111A refers to Section 112A definition. So if it becomes an equity-oriented mutual fund under Section 112A, it would also qualify under Section 111A for the 15% concessional rate of tax so far as equity-oriented mutual fund is concerned. So equity-oriented ULIP will also get this benefit. That was the whole. Now the question there is, for an equity-oriented mutual fund, you have the rules which say that you've got to take the monthly, the expression itself says that you've got to take the monthly average of the opening and closing, for the calculating the 65% or 90%. And there it has to be fulfilled for, the rules say it has to be fulfilled for the year. Now what they've done is that for this ULIP, which is not exempt under Section 1010D, to meet this requirement, it has to be met throughout the term of the policy. So if the policy is for a term of 5 years, then throughout the period of 5 years, it has to meet this criteria of 65% or 90% if it is investing in, say, exchange traded funds, for instance, So it's investing in fund of which invests in equities. So in that situation, that has to be made throughout the term of the policy and not just for the year. So because the policy will be continued for a period of minimum 3 years, most of these policies, some of them are 5-year policies. I mean, they're 10 years policies. You can decide when you want to, after 3 years, you can get out of those policies, etc. That's the way most of these policies are structured. So that is the way look at it, throughout the term of the policy. So therefore, this applied from 1st February 21, any policy issued after that date. So for instance, if a policy was issued on say 25th of February 2021 for more than 250,000, then for the months of February and March also it should have met that criteria. Otherwise, it would not qualify. For those subsequently it might comply with it. So that's what you need to keep in mind, that it's now you have to look at it throughout the term of the policy. So as I said, you get this 10% without indexation for long-term capital gains, 15% for short-term capital gains. Now, the important thing is that the manner of computation of gain would be notified. And for this, as we know, for 112A or 111A, I mean 111A, of course, there's no question of indexation. But for 112A, you have to calculate the capital gains tax at 10% of the gains without indexation. The question which will arise is, what about for not those ULIPs which are not equity oriented, which don't qualify under 112A as equity oriented? Would indexation be available is a question mark. And how would indexation, what you do, look at what is the date of acquisition of the policy? So what is the date of inception of the policy? What about premiums paid subsequently? Would that be eligible as cost of improvement, or would it be cost of acquisition? So those are all questions which arise if indexation is available. Of course, if indexation is not available, then that question doesn't arise. So therefore, one will have to look at it. The holding period also, as we know, for 12 months for equity-oriented ULIPs and 36 months for others, just like in the case of mutual funds, the same principles would be applied. Then coming to the next, this is on depreciation on goodwill. As you know, the finance bill proposed to withdraw the depreciation on goodwill. They said, and undoing the Supreme Court decision in the case of Smith Securities. So whether it's goodwill of a business or goodwill of a profession, with effect from assessment year 21-22, it would not be eligible. That was there were certain doubts expressed by various people that there is no provision to remove goodwill, which is already part of a block of intangible assets. So therefore, see, if goodwill was the only asset in the block of intangible assets, then fine, because block consists only of goodwill, and therefore possibly you would not get depreciation. But if you have got, say, patents, trademarks, various other things which you've acquired, and goodwill, the question is, there is no provision under 43.6 to remove. That was the doubt which was raised. And under 43.6, there's nothing to remove the depreciated value of goodwill from the block of intangible assets. So can I continue to claim, under WDV of the block, can I continue to claim depreciation? So that was the question which arose. And now, therefore, this amendment has been made, saying that the definition of WDV in section 43.6 has been amended. And they say that the actual cost of the goodwill, as reduced by the depreciation that would have been allowable on such goodwill for assessment year 1989 onwards, as if goodwill was the only asset in the relevant block of assets, is to be reduced. So that is to be reduced, and that reduction will have to be carried out in assessment year 21-22, because it's not to be reduced from the opening balance. It's a reduction which is provided for, and therefore, at the beginning of assessment year 21-22, if there was goodwill as part of the block of assets, then during the year you've got to show this as a separate deduction it's appearing as a separate item of deduction. So the important thing is, of course, that if such, what you've got to do is, as if you've got to assume that goodwill had been depreciation allowable on each year onwards. Now, there could be, a situation where you've not claimed depreciation in certain years. You may have claimed depreciation initially, or you may not have claimed initially, but subsequent to the Supreme Court decision, you might have started claiming. But they say that you got to claim as if goodwill had been depreciation had been allowable on such goodwill from 1889 onwards. So therefore, it seems to be an inadvertent benefit which is being given. Of course, there may be a retrospective amendment in the future. One can't rule that out, because retrospective, as this year's finance bill shows, that retrospective amendments are the order of the day. Retrospective as in it applies from assessment year 21-22, where the financial year is already over. So the important thing is that the reduction which you have to do is cannot exceed the WDV of the block. So you can't have a situation where capital gain arises under section 50 because of such reduction. So therefore, that is very important. You can reduce the block to zero, but you cannot have a situation where the it exceeds the WDV, and you therefore have some income which is taxable under section 50, a capital gain taxable under section 50. And specifically, a clause is also added that increase on account of acquisition of goodwill of a business or profession is not to be considered for increase of the block. I think this is more of a clarificatory amendment to ensure that somebody does not create some litigation, because this was not there earlier. So if you look at the amendments, so if your goodwill has already been sold earlier, then no adjustment is required, as it is not forming part of the block of assets. So therefore, there is no requirement to compute the capital gains on the past sale, etc., because it has already been adjusted. You continue to claim depreciation on the remaining block, which consists of other assets, intangible assets, and you can continue to claim that. If you have never claimed depreciation on goodwill in the past, it's never entered the block of intangible assets, and there's no impact, because your cost, for the purpose of section 55, I think they've clarified that yes, goodwill will form part of cost. So when you sell the goodwill, you can claim that cost, whatever you paid. So therefore, there will be no impact on that. As I said, if depreciation is claimed only for some years, you have to calculate the block of goodwill on a notional basis, and therefore that seems to be an unintended benefit which is there today. The proviso to section 50 has been retained that therefore, if goodwill forms part of block, the WDV and short-term capital gains to be determined in the prescribed manner. So that is a thing which we need to keep in mind. Then in slum sale, and goodwill, there is one amendment which is there related to goodwill in that. Earlier there was the finance bill proposed to amend the definition of slum sale, whereby even a slum exchange would be covered, because what we call as a slum exchange, you sell your undertaking and you get shares in exchange. For instance, there were decisions, including that of the Bombay High Court and Madras High Court, which had taken a view that in such a case, it is not liable to tax as a slum sale under section 50B, because what section 50B, the definition of slum sale under 242C, envisages that there has to be an actual sale. And unless there is a sale, and sale means sale for money. So when you exchange is not a sale. That was the view which had been taken earlier. that was now they have amendment coming to the provisions for the competition provisions. 50B has been amended now. You know, you have subsection 2 of section 50B, which deem the net worth to be the cost of acquisition and the cost of improvement. So whatever is the net worth of the undertaking, that would be. And you had expressions 1 and 2, which define the term net worth, what is the meaning of term net worth. So in expression 2, now you have a clause which is being inserted that when computing the net worth, the value of a capital asset being goodwill of business or profession, which has not been acquired by the SSE by way of purchase from a previous owner, is to be taken as nil. So where you have purchased goodwill, it will form part of net worth. If you have not purchased goodwill, if it is a self-created goodwill, or if it is a goodwill which is on by virtue of an amalgamation, created by virtue of an amalgamation, then such goodwill will not form part of the net worth when you're calculating your capital gains on a slump sale. So that is the thing. So very clearly, I think acquisition as part of a purchase. If you purchase a business on a slump sale basis, and there you allocated the consideration, and you allocated something to goodwill, that I think should clearly qualify. That would amount to a purchase of goodwill, and therefore that should qualify. That will form part of your net worth. But what if you have, see, amalgamations? You have two types of amalgamations from accounting perspective. You have amalgamations in the nature of purchase and amalgamations in the nature of merger. The question is, what if it's an amalgamation in the nature of purchase, whether it would be applicable or not? Now there, I think what's important is that this amalgamation you've got to see from the perspective of, is it a qualifying amalgamation under the Income Tax Act? If it is a qualifying amalgamation under the Income Tax Act, then this would not be regarded as a purchase. It would be regarded as a creation of a goodwill by virtue of an amalgamation, and therefore it will not get the benefit of the, it will not be regarded as part of the net worth. But where amalgamation which is carried out under the Companies Act, it qualifies as amalgamation under the Companies Act, but does not qualify as an amalgamation under the Income Tax Act for a reason that it does not meet the conditions which are prescribed under Section 2(1)(a), then in that situation, the question is that in that case, possibly it may be possible to argue that this is really a transaction of purchase, because an amalgamation is the nature of purchase, but which does not qualify as an amalgamation under the Income Tax Act. And therefore, possibly I think there is a possibility of claiming this as a part of the net worth in this situation. In case of purchase goodwill, if depreciation has not been claimed, the value is to be taken at cost so far as the net worth is concerned. As per the expression 1, because you will have to read expression 2 along with expression 1. And expression 1 says that revaluation is to be ignored. Now, when you say revaluation is to be ignored, it will mean both upward as well as downward revaluation. Because as you know, goodwill from a now India's perspective, you've got to examine every year whether there's an impairment in the value of goodwill. If there's an impairment, the impairment has to be provided for. So therefore, even in that situation, I think, you will have to ignore that. You will have to take it at cost when you're calculating net worth, irrespective of what the book value of the goodwill is, because of either upward revision or because of impairment. This is the case of context of purchase goodwill. Now, if depreciation has been claimed on the purchase goodwill, the WDV of the block of assets has to be substituted. And, the question then is, so you take the income tax WDV and not the book WDV when you're calculating the net worth of the undertaking for the purpose of calculation of capital gains on the slump sale. So question is that if there is a slump sale, say in assessment year 21-22 itself, there has been a slump sale in assessment year 21-22. Now, what do you have to do? What is your opening WDV that is to be taken? Is what it says that you substitute the opening WDV and adjust for purchases and sales during the year. That's all that is required, but is 1A and 1B. And this adjustment is as per, adjustments as per 2 are not required to be made. And the adjustment of as per clause 2 is in respect of, for goodwill, the adjustment is to be made in assessment year 21-22 as per clause 2. So therefore, no adjustment is required for goodwill in such a situation. For WDV of goodwill, you don't have to make that adjustment. By removing the goodwill, from the block of assets, that adjustment is not required to be made over here. And therefore, so that is one consequence. But that applies only so far as assessment year 21-22 is concerned. When it comes to assessment year 22-23 and onwards, the opening WDV would already have been adjusted in assessment year 21-22 to exclude goodwill from the block of intangible assets. And therefore, goodwill value would not form part of the WDV of the opening WDV. And therefore, so far as the slum sale is concerned, I think that would, in any case, therefore be taken care of in subsequent years. So therefore, there in subsequent years, the goodwill will therefore not form part. And this, I think, seems to have been an inadvertent omission, I think, when they did both the amendments for exclusion of goodwill and as well as for from the block of assets and the slum sale amendment. So therefore, this seems to be an oversight. Now, coming to the next amendment in the concept of slum sale, and this is, I think, something which affects a large number of transactions. And what they say, earlier the slum sale, your consideration was the actual sale consideration. So if you decided to sell a business for say 100 crores as a slum sale, then therefore that could be you had to calculate the capital gain between what is the book value of the undertaking and what is the sale price. So that was treated as the difference between the two was stated as the capital gain. Now, one hears that I think some large companies, in fact, some of the largest companies in the country, they have been structuring schemes saying that the undertaking will be transferred at a value which is equal to the book value as adjusted for the net asset of the block of assets under the income tax. So it is on the basis of income tax book value is what I think they were doing, so that there is no capital gain at all. So this was being transferred to a wholly owned subsidiary. This this amount of so business was being transferred to a wholly owned subsidiary, and thereafter an investor would come in who would either buy the shares from the holding company, or the investor would put in money at a sizable premium into that business, and therefore effectively there was very little tax being gained by the government on such transactions. And that's where the government said that this seems to be a manipulative transaction, and therefore unfortunately all slum sale transactions now they say that the consideration is to be taken as the fair market value of the capital assets on the date of transfer, calculated in the prescribed manner, is deemed to be the full value of consideration received or accruing as a result of transfer of such capital asset. Now, when we talk about the capital asset, it is the undertaking there. So therefore, what they say is that the fair market value of that undertaking will have to be taken, and that has to be calculated in the prescribed manner. So therefore, that will come under the income tax rules. Now, this technically is applicable from assessment year 21-22. So therefore, it will apply for all transactions which are carried out on or after 1st April 2020. So which is the year which has gone by already, which has already ended. For that year also, it will apply technically. But a very important issue here which comes up is that the rule for calculating this fair market value has not yet been notified before 1st April 2021. Can one argue that this is not applicable till such time as the rules are framed? This section will therefore not be applicable till such time as the rules are framed. In the context of Rule 8D, you had Section 14A, which had only one clause earlier. That was amended to add two clauses in from assessment year 2006-7. I think that was added. But the notification, and clause 2 of Section 14A talks about it will be calculated in the prescribed manner. The disallowance will be calculated in the prescribed manner. And Rule 8D was prescribed only in 26 March 2008. So therefore, this issue had come up. The argument was being taken was that this rule was applicable only from assessment year 2008-9 and not from assessment year 2006-7 when the section came into place. So that was the argument which was being taken. And the matter went up to the Supreme Court in the case of SR Teleholding. The Supreme Court upheld that. They said that Rule 8D applies only from assessment year 2008-9 and not from the earlier period, though the section was in place for the earlier period. So that is one way of looking at it. The other, this is of course the Supreme Court decision in the case of India Steam Navigation Company, where the Supreme Court held that the liability to pay tax is computed according to the law enforced at the beginning of the assessment year, 1st day of April. Any change in law affecting the tax liability after that date, though made during the currency of the assessment year, unless it is specifically made retrospective, does not apply to the assessment for that year. So therefore, that is the thing which one will have to wait and see whether it can have retrospective amendment applicability, etc. is a question mark, and whether the rule can be retrospective when the section is prospective, that's a question mark which will arise. And the question then is whether any adjustment, probably the way the undertaking will be calculated, I think it will be in accordance with similar to Rule 11 UA. That is what it seems to be. I think the thinking has been, if you see 11 UA, for immobile property, for securities held, for certain other valuable assets held, That's how they calculate the benefit, they calculate the net worth. And I think that's something which will probably come in for the consideration that's likely to come in. For 50C, 50CA, we've seen that similar amendments have been made. Now, interestingly, the deeming fiction is not only if the FMV is higher than the actual consideration. What if your FMV is lower than the actual consideration? Should you take the FMV or should you take the actual consideration? Now, if you look at the section says that you've got to take the FMV. So therefore, irrespective of what price you do it, you take the FMV. That seems to be the, so therefore, does this give rise to a situation where you can really do it at a higher consideration and get more money and not pay capital gains tax on that? Well, I don't know, because the question is whether they can bring it in the rule saying that, okay, the rule will apply the higher of these two values is something. I think it's something which we'll have to wait for and see what the rules will bring. And that's where one will have to see the other important impact of this amendment is that, typically what used to happen is if you wanted to convert a proprietary concern into a private limited company, or if you wanted to convert a partnership firm into a private limited company, but you are not sure whether, you will be able to fulfill those conditions which are there under Section 47, where the exemption is given for such conversions. So you're not too sure whether you'll be able to fulfill that because for 5 years, shareholding you've got to retain, is that, etc., all those things. So the question is sometimes, very often, people used to just do a slump sale of the undertaking at the book value. You would form a company, sell the undertaking at book value to that company, and there would be no capital gains tax at all. There would be no capital incidence at all. Now, if today the FMV rules say that, you've got to have a particular, the consideration is to be calculated as per the FMV, then the problem will be that today, irrespective of the price at which you do it, you may still end up paying some capital gains tax. Of course, one will have to look at the rules and see whether that would have an impact. Part-time conversion, of course, is still an option which is there, but many people think that part-time, maybe why go through the complicated route? Let's have a simple route, and that's why this was undertaken. But I think this is something which now one will have to be very careful about, whether one will meet the valuation. What is that valuation under? So you may need to actually do the value as per what is the valuation as per the rule. You may need to do the transaction as per that, provided, of course, it does not realize in a result in a substantial capital gains. So that's something which you may need to look at. Intra-group reorganization, therefore, will now get more complex because typically, what would happen is you wanted to, one company was holding substantial assets and also a business, and you wanted to merge, two businesses instead of doing a demerger, etc. Very often, companies prefer that let's just do a slump sale at book value, and rather than so that the money comes into this company rather than doing a demerger, because demerger, as you know, takes sometimes 9 to 12 months. It's a time-consuming process. And that's why very often a slump sale was preferred. But there now again, that's something which we will have to see how it will whether it is feasible, not feasible, how it will have to be done, etc. So those are things which will, of course, this retrospective amendment, as I said, seems to be to attack that particular company which has done this at and a sizable amount. I think running into thousands of crores. I think it has done it in the financial year 2020-21, and that's where I think the government is looking at getting a sizable revenue. Now let's come to the main topic, and that is on the amendments relating to partnership firms. So, what was proposed was you had earlier in the finance bill, you had section 45.4 and 45.4A. 45.4 was, people were not sure what it meant. 45.4A seemed to indicate that it was a replacement of the existing 45.4, where the capital asset is transferred, on reconstitution or dissolution of the firm, then the firm would pay tax. So therefore, that was the feeling which was there. But 45.4, there was some doubt as what would apply. Now, I think there are two sections which have, which are there very clearly. Instead of 45, there is no 45.4A. So the existing section 45.4 has been replaced by a new section 45.4, and you have a new section 9B which has been introduced. Now, section 45.4, which was there earlier, is rule 9, section 9B in the new avatar. So now it is section 9B, which corresponds to section 45.4 as it was earlier. But the one significant change is 45.4, which was there earlier. We know that what was 45.4. It said that if on dissolution of a firm or otherwise, any capital asset is distributed to a partner, then the firm has to pay the capital gains tax on the difference between the fair market value of the asset and the book value of the asset. That was the earlier provision of 45(4). Now, for 9B says a similar thing. The only difference here, and the significant difference, is that it says that income on receipt of capital asset or stock in trade by a specified person. I mean, they talk about specified entity and specified person. When they talk about specified person, it means a partner or a member, and specified entity is a partnership firm or a AOP or a BOI. So either of these, when for convenience, I will just refer to it when we are discussing. I will refer to the partner and the firm for convenience. You can understand it that it will also apply to AOP, BOI, etc. So that's what you need to keep in mind. So therefore, what does the section say? It says income on receipt of a capital asset or stock in trade by a partner from a partnership firm. That is what is taxed under this. The receipt by the partner during the previous year of capital asset or stock in trade or both from a firm in connection with dissolution or reconstitution of such firm. Under that circumstances, the firm is deemed to have transferred such capital asset or stock in trade or both to the partner in the year in which such capital asset or stock in trade or both are received by the partner. How is the profits and gains to be computed? It says profits and gains on such deemed transfer of capital asset or stock in trade or both by the firm is deemed to be income of the firm of the previous year in which the capital asset or the stock in trade or both are received by the partner, and it is chargeable to capital tax as income of the firm under profits and gains of business or profession or capital gains as the case may be. So to the extent it relates to stock in trade, it will be taxed as business income. To the extent it relates to capital asset, it will be taxed as capital gains. So that is the way it is. And how is it further to be computed? The fair market value of the capital asset or stock in trade or both is deemed to be the full value of the consideration received or accruing as a result of this deemed transfer of capital asset or stock in trade or both by the firm. So you have to look at the fair market value of the capital asset or the fair market value of the stock in trade, and that will be the consideration deemed to be received or accrued by the firm. What is the definition of reconstitution? Because in the bill there was this doubt as to what is the meaning of reconstitution. Now reconstitution has been defined to mean that one or more partners cease to be partners. That is a retirement of a partner effectively. One or more new partners are admitted, such that one or more persons who were partners before the change continue to be partners after the change. So therefore, there has to be one or more new partners being admitted, but there has to be a continuation of the existing partners. You will say, what about a situation where 3 new partners come in and the 2 existing partners go out? What happens over there? There, that will be covered by the first clause because there are 2 partners who are retiring. So in any case, that is covered by the first clause. So what the second clause covers is a situation where there is no retirement of any partner, but one or more new partners are admitted. And the third situation of reconstitution is all the partners continue with a change in the respective shares of some or all of them. So therefore, change in the profit sharing ratio is also deemed to be a situation of reconstitution. So therefore, these are the 3 sorts of reconstitution. Now let's look at some of the issues which do arise under section 9B. So this, as we know, is effective from assessment year 21-22, and the charge of tax is in the year of receipt by the partner. The firm pays the tax, but the charge of tax depends on the year of receipt by the partner. That is the position in law. Whether it applies to dissolution or retirement in an earlier year. Suppose there was a dissolution or retirement prior to 1st April 2020, but the receipt is after 1st April 2020. Would it apply? Possibly. I think one can argue that basically it has to be read in the context that the receipt goes along with the event, and since the event happened prior, this receipt cannot be taxed in assessment at 21-22. I think it's an argument which is open, I think there is some this thing to be said for that, because obviously, I mean, you can't have a situation where something is just because you received it in that year, and though effectively the transaction which gave rise to that receipt was earlier point of time, just because the taxation is from a receipt perspective. That's the question here really is whether only actual receipt is to be considered or also constructive receipt. Say for instance, on retirement of a partner, the amount is credited to his account in the books of the firm but not paid out. So do you look at the constructive receipt or only actual receipt? And I think you look at only the actual receipt. You should not, otherwise there was no need to say receipt. They could have very well said that on receipt or accrual, whichever is earlier, they could have very well said that, but that's not the way it is. So it says it is only, I think, therefore you have to look at it as the actual receipt in terms, by the partner concerned. It's at that point of time. Uh, the receipt has to be only from the partnership firm and not from the other partners. So that is important. Uh, Therefore, suppose a partner retires and he's paid something by the continuing partners for giving up his share. Now, there, I think the question is, one may have to look at it that if he's assigning shares to the other partners, possibly the provision of section 45(1) itself may apply. This may be a capital gain, which is a transfer of the his share, his interest in the partnership firm itself. And therefore, 45(1) may apply in that situation. So therefore, that may apply. 56 to 10 may not apply, I think, there, because one is getting in exchange for a consideration. So 56 to 10 may not apply, I think, in that situation. But I think that's the thing. But at least here, this section 9B applies only when you receive it from the partner receives it from the partnership firm itself. There is no definition of fair market value here, and there is no, it is not as I say that the rule will be prescribed for this, unlike for slum sale, where it says that the rule will be prescribed. Here, there is no rule which will be prescribed. The section does not require a rule to be prescribed. The question, therefore, is whether the valuation will be under section 50C, you look at the stamp duty valuation, or 43CA, which is again stamp duty valuation, or 50CA, which requires you to look at the, if it's shares, for instance, do you go to the rule 11UA valuation? Can this be applied, or the 56 to 10 method valuation definition of fair value, which is again rule 11UA, can this be applied? Or do we look at section 222B, which says fair market value means the value it would fetch in the open market if it was sold in the open market? Do you apply that? That's the question. And the answer to that depends upon whether section 9B and 50C, 43CA, 50CA can apply simultaneously. This concept has arisen in the context of section 45(4) read with section 50, the question 50C, the question has arisen as to whether immovable property, for instance, a situation where immovable property is given to a partner on retirement. The question is whether they apply simultaneously. Can it be applied? So 45(4) deems the retirement to take place, and 50C deems that you have to take the stamp duty valuation and not the amount, or 45(3), where a property is introduced to the partnership firm. So do you look at that? That is the question, which is so there. I think, of course, you had the special bench decision in United Marine Academy, which was in the context of section 50 and 50C. They said that section 50C will apply for the purpose of section 50, which is depreciable assets. For that purpose, the provision of section 50C, which requires you to take the stamp duty value, that will apply. That was the view which was taken. But I think in the context of 45(4) and read with 45(3) read with 50C, I think there, in that context, there have been decisions which have indicated that perhaps that would not apply, and that, I think, is the better view of the matter. That possibly because 9B itself is a deeming fiction, it deems certain consideration. I think if you look at it, it's a whole method of taxation of that particular type of income. It's a whole scheme of taxation, and therefore you can't pick and choose, saying I will take this part of the scheme which deems it to be a transfer, and then when it comes to deeming the consideration, I will go to 50C or 50CA. I think that cannot be done, and that's where. But again, this is something which will be an area for litigation in the future. There is no corresponding provision for adjustment of cost in the hands of the partner. Now, a partner is given an asset, a capital asset or stock in trade from the partnership firm. The question is, what is the cost to the partner? I think there is no this which is there. And in fact, there is a deduction which is prescribed under 48(3), but that applies only to a 45(4) situation, which we'll come to later, but that will not apply in this situation. To section 9B, again, that is not there, but we'll see how the interplay there will be. But this is, so therefore, this again is an area which today also under section 45(4), existing 45(4), this question was there as to what is the cost to the partner. Is it the fair market value on the date of distribution to the capital asset, or is it the cost to the partnership firm? Therefore, that is something which, again, that dispute will still continue. Then the period of holding for the capital asset, obviously, you start with the date of acquisition of the capital asset by the partnership firm. But what would be the date of transfer? Would it be the date of receipt by the partner, or would it be the date of dissolution of the firm, or the reconstitution of the firm? Now, therefore, the problem here really is that, and which could be an area for argument, is that there is no amendment made to the definition of transfer in section 247. So therefore, one can perhaps argue that this date of receipt is not a transfer, etc. So that is an argument which is still open. But of course, as you know, in the context of when 45.4 was introduced at that time, this argument was there. But at that stage, it was said that this is a whole scheme which has to be read as a whole, and therefore, ultimately, most of the tribal courts and tribunals and courts have taken the view that you've got to look at it that yes, it's a whole scheme of transfer of capital, and therefore, at that point of time, it would be the date of, there would be a transfer. Transfer is deemed to have taken place when the firm distributes capital assets, though it is not said so in so many words. So I think that is something which would still apply. Then, the question is that this is, you could have capital gains, you could have business profits under Section 9B, depending on whether it's a capital asset which is given or whether it's a stock in trade which is given. And if it's capital gains which is given, so the question is, say if it's a capital asset which is a long-term capital asset, you have long-term capital gains. Can you claim the benefit of exemption under Section 54 EC? Because here we are looking at a partnership firm or an AOP or a BOI, so therefore it's only 54 EC that you really need to look at. And there, I think, yes, 54 EC should be available, that benefit should be available, because once you deem it to be a long-term capital gain, all the consequences should follow, and therefore you would get the benefit of the. Now, the question is, when you have to invest it within a period of 6 months, so what is the date of transfer? Is it the date of dissolution, or the date of change of constitution, or the date of receipt? I think the better view here is that it would be the date of receipt which should be regarded, because the charging fiction also arises at the time of receipt, and that's the way one should look at it. The issue arises that where the capital asset forms part of the block of asset, then are you required to adjust, what are you supposed to do? Because they say that it is deemed to be a consideration so far as this is concerned, and the provisions of the capital gains would apply. Firm is deemed to have transferred such capital asset, and here, 43.6, there is no provision to reduce this provision. There is no provision. So can one argue that no, 43.6 does not this at all, and therefore I don't reduce to reduce? I think when you look at a scheme, possibly you look at it as a holistic thing. One has to look at it. That is the normal consequences. Suppose you had a block of assets where the WDV of the block of assets was, say, 50 lakhs, and the fair market value of this capital asset which is transferred is, say, 60 lakhs. So how you would have to calculate your capital gain? I think there's no doubt on that. 60 lakh minus 50 lakhs, so 10 lakhs is the capital gain. Now, just because the fair market value of the asset is, say, 40 lakhs, can you say that, no, I will not reduce this 40 lakhs from the 50 lakhs and bring down the WDV to 10 lakhs? I think, when you look at it from a perspective of the integrated scheme, I think you would have to do it, though it is not expressly provided under Section 43.6. That is something which, where I think that's the fair way to do it. Then let's look at Section 45.4. Now, what does 45.4 say? 45.4 is now, as you said, 9B is your equivalent of Section 45.4, which is then was. This 45.4 is for a completely different purpose. What it seeks to do is, where a partner receives more from the partnership firm than his capital balance in the firm, then he is liable to be taxed on that difference or the gain that he makes. That is what it seeks to tax. So where does it apply? It applies where the partner receives money or a capital asset or a both from a firm during the year from the firm in connection with the reconstitution of the firm. And profits and gains arising from such receipt by the partner is chargeable to tax as income of the firm under the head capital gains, not as income of the partner. So though it is really income of the partner, the capital gains is earned by the partner, here it is taxable as the income of the firm under the head capital gains. Similar to Section 9B, it is deemed to be income of the firm of the previous year in which the money or capital asset or both are received by the partner. And the profits and gains have to be determined as per the following formula. That is, A is equal to B minus C, A is equal to B plus C minus D. And what is A? A is the income chargeable to tax as capital gains. B is the money received by the partner from the firm on the date of receipt. And C is the fair market value of the capital asset received by the partner from the firm on the date of such receipt. And what is B? B is the balance in the capital account of the partner in the books of account of the firm at the time of reconstitution. So you calculate, you add the money plus the fair market value of the capital asset which is received by the partner, and you reduce whatever was his capital balance in the firm at the time of reconstitution of the firm. They say that if this answer, that is A is the answer to this. If A is negative, the value is deemed to be zero. So you can therefore never have a situation of a loss, claiming a loss under this provision. Now, they say balance in the capital account could be represented in any manner, but it should be without taking into account increase due to revaluation of any asset, or due to self-generated goodwill, or any other self-generated asset. So therefore, you don't have to take into account any increase due to revaluation or self-generated goodwill or any other self-generated asset. You don't take that into account. Then there is a explanation which is I read, which says that when the capital asset is received by the partner in connection with reconstitution, the provisions of this section are to operate in addition to the provisions of section 9B, and taxation is to be worked out independently. So that is the clarificatory provision. And now let's look at each of these provisions and how they work. So therefore, this is effective from assessment year 21-22, and the charge of tax is in the year of receipt by the partner from the firm. So again, the same situation where the partner has retired from the firm earlier year, etc. So that is the same this arises. Now here, what we have to keep in mind is, here though it is the partnership firm which is taxed, but really it is the gain of the partner which is taxed in the hands of the firm. So can the firm recover the tax from the partner effectively by saying, okay, I will pay you lesser amount, etc. So firm can inbuild that by saying that, okay, I will pay you lesser amount, and therefore, you do a simultaneous equation and figure out what is the amount to be paid net of the tax which will have to be paid by the firm on account of the partner's gains. So that is something which can certainly be done. I think that working is something which can be done. Now, a very important thing here is that this provision applies only on reconstitution of the firm. It does not apply on dissolution of the firm. Unlike both on dissolution or reconstitution. So therefore, it does not apply on dissolution at all. So if a partner if the firm is dissolved, and if one of the partners receives only money on dissolution of the firm, the other partner takes over the business, the excess amount received by the partner on dissolution would not be taxable at all. That is the thing. Or even if he receives money and some capital assets, but it's the excess amount, that excess amount will not be taxable because 45(4) does not apply to dissolution of the firm at all. So the converse is also true, that if today a partner's capital account is say 50 lakhs, but on dissolution he receives only 30 lakhs, the amount of shortfall which he receives, the 20 lakhs, he cannot claim it as a loss. Of course, overall on dissolution, it is bound to be neutral because, if the firm sells its assets and, it incurs capital gains or capital losses, etc. And, then when it distributes, obviously, it's after those gains or losses. And again, if it distributes unevenly, one partner will gain, another will have a loss. So therefore, it will effectively neutralize itself. So overall, it should be neutral unless some partner is not liable to tax on some reason, etc. Now, the other important difference between 9B and this section is this applies only on receipt of money or capital asset. It does not include stock in trade. So there it does not, 9B does not include money. 45(4) does not include stock in trade. So suppose, on reconstitution of the firm or on dissolution of the firm, stock in trade is given to a partner. Is the gain of the partner not taxable? The question is. So there are two ways of looking at it. One is that possibly on when the firm is, there's a retirement or, there's a dissolution of the firm. Of course, you have ICDS, which now provides that, in such a situation, the partnership firm has to pay the tax on the difference between the fair market value of the stock in trade and the book value. That will be taxed as business profits. But in a situation where, it is accounting for it at cost and, not at fair market value, the question is, can one say that the stock in trade has got converted into a capital asset at the time of withdrawal and therefore their business profits is taxable? If you look at the Delhi special bench decision in the case of DLF Universal in 123 ITD, this question had arisen, and there the view was that that was a situation where a partner introduced his stock in trade into a partnership firm as by way of capital introduction. And the question there was whether 45(3) provision, section 45(3) would apply at all. There the Delhi tribunal said that whatever was the character of that asset in the hands of the partner when he held it in his individual capacity. The character changes, undergoes a change at the point of time that he introduces it into the partnership firm, and therefore he introduces it as a capital asset. That was the view which the Delhi special bench of the tribunal took at that, in that decision. And if that logic is followed, then possibly that business profit would be get taxable in any case. So therefore, that gain would anyway be income of the firm. The question is, what if when you're talking about capital asset, what about receipt of agricultural land in a rural area? Is that covered? And this controversy is there in the context of section 56(2)(10) or 46(2). There have been decisions which have held that yes, it is taxable. There have been decisions to the contrary. So that is a controversy which will continue over here under this section as well. This issue will still continue to, because agricultural land in a rural area which is beyond those 8 kilometers of municipal limits may not be is not a capital asset as defined. So the question is, when you mean capital asset, does it mean as in contradiction to stock in trade, or do you mean the capital asset as defined? And therefore, that's the issue which will still remain open. The interesting thing here is that if a partner, you have a provision that saying that the death of a partner shall not dissolve the firm, and there are 3 partners, one of the partners dies. Then there is a reconstitution of the firm because he ceased to be a partner. The question is, in that situation where the amount is received by the legal heirs of the deceased partner, whether this would be covered. I think this would not be covered because it only talks about received by a partner from a partnership firm. So if it is received by the legal heirs of a partner, that would not be covered. 45(4) would not apply in that. Interestingly, here there is no specific exemption for a partner. The question here is, would this be under the exempt because of the principle that the basic general principle that reconstitution is not a transfer? Would this be on that ground? You had the old decision in the case of Malabar Fisheries, and you had that Supreme Court decisions, etc. All those various decisions which held that retirement, Mohan Bhai, Pama Bhai, etc. All those decisions where the view was taken that retirement, etc., is not a transfer. Malabar Fisheries dissolution is not a transfer. Mohan Bhai, Pama Bhai said retirement is not a transfer. So is it under that principle that the partner can claim exemption? Or also possibly the partner can claim exemption under section 10(2)(a), that his share in the total income of the firm. And if the firm is being considered and he's exempted on it, he can't again be taxed on that. So therefore, I think the partner should be able to claim the benefit of the exemption. Loss cannot be claimed under section 45(4), as we saw that in the formula A is equal to B plus C minus D. If that is negative, the value is to be taken as 0. But that situation, the adjustment under section 48(3), the deduction which you'll get under 43, that would also be nil because you can't take it as a figure because nothing is taken over there, nothing is added under 45(4). The important issue is, do I do the computation overall, or is that to be vis-a-vis each partner? I think the computation has to be vis-a-vis each partner. Some partner may gain, some partners may lose. And if only gains are to be taken and losses not taken, ultimately the firm may end up paying some tax, though overall it's neutral. Now that is the unfortunate part of this, the way it has been drafted, but that is the way it is. The other issue then which comes up is, would the capital balance include the current account as well as the loan balances of the partners? If you look at the provisions of this, they've specifically said that in the formula, below the formula, they've specifically said that the balance in capital account represented in any manner. And therefore, I would feel that yes, the intention is to cover both current account and loan balance of partners as well, and it's not just the capital per se, fixed capital per se. What about proportionate share of reserves? Are these to be considered as part of capital balance? I think you should transfer those reserves to the partner concerned before doing this thing, because it does belong to the partner concerned, and therefore it should be. What if there's a waiver of a debit balance? A partner on retirement, say for instance, has a debit balance in his capital or in his current account, and say 50 lakhs is the debit balance overall after adding his capital to his current account to his loan account. There's an amount of 50 lakhs due to the firm. And on his retirement, the firm says, okay, we are waiving this amount of balance from the firm. What happens to that situation? Whether this would be taxable, the waiver of the debit balance? I think, here what is happening is that the partner is not receiving any amount. And therefore, I would feel that possibly that there the provisions of Section 45(4) would not apply at all in that situation, because there is no receipt of any amount. As we said, that receipt has to be and for then the question here is, what if there's a negative capital balance? How do you compute? Suppose, assuming that you've got a negative capital balance and you receive some money. Say, for instance, your capital balance is negative 50 lakhs and you receive 10 lakhs. So should you take your capital, should the capital gains of the firm be 60 lakhs, or would the capital gains be only 10 lakhs? You ignore the negative. That's the way you've got to look at it. I think in this situation, because the arithmetic formula, the way it works, it would be minus 50 uh, sorry, it would be 10 minus 50, which will give you 10 plus 50, and therefore it will give you 60. That's why it will work arithmetically. Also, we have a similar issue which had come up before in the context of Section 50B slum sale, that if there was a negative figure of net worth and there was a consideration paid, do you have to add that negative figure of net worth to arrive at what the capital gains is? So do you add, so the consideration was say 10 lakhs and you had a negative net worth of 50 lakhs, do you add 50 to that 10 lakhs and make it 60 lakhs? Is the capital gains, or is the capital gains only 10 lakhs? And there, I think the special bench tribunal had taken a view that you cannot ignore the negative figure of net worth for the working of capital gains in case of a slum sale. How do you determine the holding period now you're in this situation? Because here what you're looking at is, we are not looking at the transfer of the asset by the firm. You're looking at the gain which is made by the partner, which is taxable in the hands of the firm. So how do you determine the holding period in this situation? Do you look at it from the date of admission of the partner? I would think so, that yes, you look at from the date of admission of the partner till the date that he ceases to be a partner. Look at that period. Is it more than 3 years or is it less than 3 years? That's the way you should look at it. It seems that no indexation will be available because the gain they've said would be taxed as per that formula. A is equal to B plus C minus D. So there is no space for indexation over there. That this is an entire scheme for taxation itself, integrated scheme, and therefore you can't go to Section 48 and claim the benefit of indexation. What if there's an increase in profit share in the last 3 years? Say, for instance, a partner had he had a 10% interest in the firm. That 10% interest increased to 25% around 2 years ago. What happens then? Do you say that, and he's now retiring from the partnership firm, so he's giving up his entire 25% interest in the firm? Would you say that so far as the 10% is concerned, that is the long-term gain, the 15% is concerned, that is the short-term gain, and therefore you bifurcate the consideration into 2 parts and calculate short-term gain separately, long-term gain separately? Or do you look at his interest in the partnership firm as a whole? Well, I think this is an area where I think one can look at it that what is you transferring? You're transferring your interest in the partnership firm. When did you acquire that interest in the partnership firm? That is when you became a partner in the partnership firm. Subsequently, if your ratio went up, your share of the partnership profit went up. That is maybe if you incurred a cost for that, that is a cost of improvement, if at all. But it is possibly now, I mean, the negative part of it is that the department may turn around and say that, okay, that is it deductible for the purpose of the amount which you paid for getting that extra amount? Is it deductible? So therefore, that's something which you need to keep in mind when you're taking that argument. They may say that, okay, then the amount will not give you that as a deduction because you've not paid anything for acquiring this. So far, I mean, it's your part, just your share in is what we look at, and therefore, in any case, because that amount which you paid for acquiring that asset, in any case, of course, that will not be deductible because your gain has to be computed as per the formula. So I think the better view, therefore, seems to be that you look at it from the date that you became a partner rather than the date that you increase the share, or you don't look at that. Now, what if the settlement to the partner is spread over more than 1 year? How do you compute it? And there possibly one can look at, in the context of Section 46(2), we had the Bombay High Court decision in the case of cable and wireless in 90 ITR 84. So where the Bombay High Court said in which year is it taxable, they looked at it that where receipt of monies on liquidation was being received of the company was being received over multiple years. They said it would be taxable in each year of receipt. That's what they said. And effectively the way it was is that, then what do you adjust? In this case, you're supposed to reduce the capital balance. So how do you adjust the capital balance? I think you've got to adjust the capital balance first against the initial amount received by the partners. I think that's the way you will have to do it. So in the first year itself, you adjust whatever capital balance is there. If something is left over, then you adjust against subsequent year. But the interesting thing is, so that seems to be the thing. But if you look at the formula really requires you to adjust in each year the capital balance. So can I say in year one, I will reduce the entire capital balance. In year two also, when I receive some other amounts, I will again reduce the entire capital balance. In year three, again, if I receive some more further amounts, if I receive it in 3 years, I will further reduce the same capital balance, which I've already reduced the earlier 2 years, I can again reduce. Well, the language seems to indicate so, but I think, that does seem to be an extreme view which is there. And therefore, I don't know how, the tribunals or courts would look at it. Possibly they may read it down and they'll say, no, you can't claim double deduction, etc. It may be only once that you can claim this as a deduction. There could be a situation where there is a revaluation of assets by the firm, typically prior to retirement. Because this talks about a situation where you ignore the revaluation when you're looking at the capital balance, etc. You ignore and suppose, let's say that the capital balance of the partner was say 10 lakhs. There's a revaluation whereby another 50 lakhs is credited through his account, and he withdraws the entire 60 lakhs. This revaluation happened and the withdrawal happened, say maybe 2 years before his retirement. Now, what happens when he retires? Can you say that effectively there's nothing in connection with the retirement, etc. Because all the partners were given that the firm had the liquid, firm paid everybody off the thing. So therefore, it was not in connection with the constitution that this amount has been, and therefore now the partner is not receiving anything. Say he's already taken out everything. He's assuming that he's not paid anything on final retirement. Then one can take the view that this will. I think this may be a planning which is best avoided, frankly speaking, because though it seems that yes, that is the argument which is there, but again, this may be regarded. One is the provision of GAR may be sought to be attracted in this case where the amounts are substantial. The second thing is that possibly the courts may also not try to take undue advantage when the manner in which this has to be done. So that's something which I think is best avoided. Now let's look at an example and how. Let's look at what sorts of transactions will apply to and when this will apply. So here, firstly, look at the situation of retirement of a partner. If nothing is paid to the partner, does Section 9B apply? No. 45(4) also will not apply on retirement partner if nothing is paid out. On retirement of a partner, if money is paid out, Section 9B will not apply because it applies only to capital asset and stock and trade. But 45(4) will be applicable because it is either capital asset or money. So therefore, 45(4) will apply, 9B will not apply. Where there's a retirement of a partner and he is given capital assets, both 9B and 45(4) will apply. Where there's a retirement of a partner and he's given stock in trade, only 9B will apply, 45(4) will not apply in that situation at all. And there could be some absurdities which could result, that where a partner, of course, as I said, there it may be because of the fact that the firm may be taxed in any case on that income which he receives by way of stock in trade. Therefore, that may be a conscious decision not to tax, that. Now, very often, what happens is when you want to admit a partner, you will create a goodwill and before admission of the new partner, so that you will revalue the assets or, so you create a goodwill, etc. So, therefore, the question is what happens in that situation where, some amount is withdrawn by the existing partners. So if nothing is withdrawn by the existing partners, then neither 9B or 45(4) applies because as we saw, there has to be an actual receipt. Where money is received, then 9B will not apply, 45(4) will apply. As we saw earlier also in case of retirement, the same logic will apply in these situations. What if there's a change in profit sharing ratio? Now, if there's a change in profit sharing ratio and no money exchanges hands from the firm to the partners, then in that situation, I think neither 9B nor Section 45(4) will apply. But if there's a change in profit sharing ratio and one partner has paid something, towards on that occasion, then I think 9B will not apply, 45(4) will apply. Vice versa, if it's a capital asset, both will apply. And if it's stock in trade, only 9B will apply, 45(4) will not apply. On dissolution of a firm, what will happen? If nothing is given, if money is given, capital asset is given, or stock in trade is given. So if capital asset or stock in trade is given, 9B will apply, but 45(4) will not apply under any circumstances to dissolution at all. So that is the position. The interesting question which comes up now here, and which is when you're looking at both the sections read together, you have a situation where a partner retires from a partnership firm. He is given a certain, so therefore it is reconstitution. Therefore, both the sections apply. 9B applies, 45(4) also applies. he's given a capital asset on his retirement from the partnership firm. So therefore, both 9B and 45(4) will apply, because 9B capital asset or stock in trade. So therefore, capital asset, it applies. 45 talks of 4 talks of money or capital asset, and therefore 45(4) also applies. So both these sections will apply. Then the question here is that, can one say that first I will calculate my gain under section 45(4). There is a gain to the firm under section 45(4). And that gain, and what does 48(3) say? 48(3) requires you to, and the language is pretty bad, frankly speaking. 45(3), the intention seems to be quite different from the way it is drafted. And unfortunately, 48(3) has not been redrafted when they did the amendment. 48(3) reads like this. What is section 48? 48 is the mode of computation. And they are saying that you have to deduct the following amounts from the consideration when you're computing the capital gains. First is, of course, your expenditure incurred wholly in exclusive connection with the transfer. Second, clause 2 is the cost of acquisition of the asset and cost of any improvement thereto. And clause 3 is, now which is inserted, in case of value of any money or capital asset received by a specified person from a specified entity referred to in section 45(4), the amount chargeable to income tax as income of such specified entity under that subsection, which is attributable to the capital asset being transferred by the specified entity, calculated in the prescribed manner. So they're saying that whatever is attributable to that capital asset will be deducted, is to be deducted on calculating the capital gains. Now the question is, which capital gains are we talking about? Are we talking about the 45(4) capital gains? No, obviously not, because here they say that whatever is taxable under 45(4), the gain which is chargeable to tax under 45(4) is to be considered under 48(3). So obviously we are not talking about 45(4). Are we talking about 9B gains, or are we talking about other capital gains on transfer of? No, I think here what the intention is, and if you look at the explanatory memorandum, the explanatory memorandum objective is to mitigate double taxation, whereby So therefore, it seems that whenever that capital asset which is transferred, whether it is by virtue of the reconstitution or whether it is by virtue of a sale subsequently, this deduction will be allowed. Whatever has been taxed in the 45(4) will be allowed as a deduction on computing the capital gain on transfer of that asset. I think that's the way which one would have to look at it. Though whether 9B can be simultaneously, you can apply at the same time, that could be an area of litigation. But I think if one looks at the intention, I think clearly the intention is to give you that, as a deduction, so that otherwise what will happen is that it is the firm which is being taxed on the capital gain, as well as the partner who's being taxed on that. So there is an element of double taxation over there to that extent, and that is the problem. So now having understood these provisions, now let's look at a certain one example, so that I think the position becomes very clear. So let's take a simple situation of retirement of a partner A from a firm on 30th June 2021. Because going forward, assuming that is going forward, there's a capital current and loan balance on 30th June 2021. His capital current and loan balance total is 80 lakhs. Now the firm transfers on 15th July 21. The firm transfers stock in trade to him. The cost of that stock in trade is 7,50,000, but the book value is 6 lakhs because it has been valued at lower of cost or net market realizable value. So therefore, it has been valued down to 6 lakhs. But the fair market value now on 15th July 21 is, say, 7 lakhs. So therefore, he's got if you take the fair market value, it's 7 lakhs that he's got, though the book value is only 6 lakhs. Money has been paid to him on 31st August 21 of 50 lakhs. So against 80 lakhs, he's got 7 lakhs worth of stock in trade, 50 lakhs of money. And in the subsequent year, on 30th April 2022, land whose book value is 5 lakhs and whose index cost is 15 lakhs, but whose fair market value as on 30th April 2022 is 45 lakhs, is given to him. So what does he get in total? He gets 7 lakhs plus 50 lakhs plus 45 lakhs. Total, he gets 1 crore 2 lakhs as against his amount due to him as well as the books of accounts of 80 lakhs. So that is the position. Now, what will happen in assessment year 2022-23? So you will apply your section 9B. What is the fair, because stock in trade has been transferred. So the fair market value of the stock in trade which has been given is 7 lakhs. The book value of that stock in trade is 6 lakhs, and therefore the amount which will be taxed over there is will be taxed as 1 lakh will be taxed as business profits of the firm. Now, so far as the money and capital asset, the capital asset is received in the subsequent year, so you don't have to include in this year. But so far as the money is received, 45-4 competition will be applied. 50 lakhs is received. Now, what is the capital balance of the partner? The capital balance is 80 lakhs. So the negative figure is 30 lakhs, and therefore the capital gains is nil in this situation. 45-4 competition results in a nil capital gains in this situation for assessment year 2023. So only the firm will be taxed on 1 lakh rupees under section 9B in assessment year 22-23. When it comes to assessment year 23-24, what do you get? You get the 9B computation because 9B applies both to stock in trade as well as capital asset. Your transferred land, which is a capital asset. What is the fair market value of the land on 30th April 2022, which is 45 lakhs? This takes you then to section 48. The computation of capital gains is in accordance with section 48. So therefore, you will take index cost of acquisition of the land, which is 15 lakhs. So therefore, you'll get a gain of 30 lakhs. So the gain was 30 lakhs under section 9B. Then let's come to that 15 lakhs. We'll come to a little later. What is the deduction in 43? Whether one should, as one said, saw that. If it does a 45-4 competition, what is the capital asset received? Capital asset received is 45 lakhs. What is the capital balance which is left from the earlier year after paying him the money? It is 30 lakhs. So therefore, 15 lakhs is the capital gains. Though of course they talk about capital balance as on the date of the retirement, which should be 80 lakhs. That is the argument which has been taken. But I think you're, assuming that one follows a conservative view, then the capital gains would be 15 lakhs in this situation. Because this 15 lakhs, assuming that, let's for a moment assume that the entire thing is attributable to the capital asset, which is land, then I'm calculating the capital gains on the land which is transferred. I will reduce this 15 lakhs and therefore I will arrive at a net capital gains of 15 lakhs under section 9B. So that's how you get, 15 lakhs will be taxed under section 9B and 15 lakhs will be taxed under section 45-4. So you have 30 lakhs being taxed here, 1 lakh being taxed in the early year under 9B. So a total of 31 lakhs is taxed. Though the amount, if you look at it, what is the amount that the partner, so here you're looking at the taxation of the entire thing, which is the firm as well as the partner. Now, if you look at this in this situation, what is the benefit which the firm, which the partner has got? The partner has got 57 plus 45, 1 crore 2 lakhs. So 22 lakhs is what the partner has benefited. The firm has benefited because it has given an asset, worth 15 lakhs, whose index cost is 15 lakhs, it has given for 45 lakhs. So it is 30 lakhs plus 22 lakhs. So though the gain really in this situation is 52 lakhs, what you are taxing really is only 1 lakh plus 30 lakhs. So 31 lakhs. So therefore that seems to be the position. I don't know whether this computation, one will have to wait and see the rules, etc. So I mean, the clarificatory circular, etc. One will have to see, but this is what it seems to be the position as of now. So that is so far as the partnership firm this is concerned. Then let's go on to some of the other amendments. And section 115JB, as you know, there was an amendment which says that if there was a increase in book profits of the current year due to income of the past years on account of advanced pricing arrangement or on account of secondary adjustment of the earlier years, then on the application, SSC can make an application to the AO to recompute the book profits of the past year and the tax payable for this year in the prescribed manner. So, now this will apply. They say now the clarification attached to it, say that this will apply only if the tax credit is not utilized under section 115JW. If the tax credit has already been utilized, then the question of adjustment of that does not. Now, what if a partial tax credit is utilized? I think the way the language is, it seems that even if a partial tax credit is utilized, this may not apply at all. That's the thing. And the other amendment in the context of this amendment, proposed amendment is that they said that this will apply from assessment year 2020-21. And also no interest would be payable on a refund which arises on account of such recomputation. Because what will happen is that you're saying that because the book profits of the earlier years will be increased, you're applying to the assessing officer saying that please increase the book profits of the earlier years and reduce my book profit of this year. So therefore you may get a refund because of that. And therefore, and that whether you should get interest on that, they're saying that no interest will be allowable to you on that rectification. On reassessment, as you know that we have got a completely new scheme of reassessment from 1st April 2021, of course, subject to that extension of 30 days which they've granted for the old. Now, there are two amendments which are there. There was this thing that what are the circumstances under which the notice can be issued, and that is where the assessing officer has information suggesting that income has escaped assessment. And there was a deeming fiction that under certain circumstances, the assessing officer would be deemed to have information suggesting that income has escaped assessment. Uh, Earlier, the reference there was one of the cases covered under that deeming fiction was all cases of survey under section 133A on or after 1st April 21 was covered. Now what they've done is two types of surveys are excluded. So TDS survey, which can be conducted under 133A 2A, or there could be a survey of a function, ceremony, or an event under subsection 5 of 133A. Now these are excluded from the concept of survey, which was deemed where there's a deeming fiction that the AO has information suggesting that income has escaped assessment. So therefore, reassessment in those 3 years period will not be automatically possible under section on the case of TDS surveys or surveys of function, ceremonies, and events. That will not be possible. Similarly, for seizure and requisition on or after 1st April 21 was the language where it was deeming fiction that AO had information suggesting that income has escaped assessment. So now they say that only seizure or requisition, which is permitted under section 132 or 132A, only that is to be considered. So therefore, there may be some seizure or requisition which is not authorized or which is not in accordance with 132, 132A. Now that sort of seizure or requisition will not be governed by the deeming fiction. That deeming fiction will not arise, and there, the assessing officer will have to prove otherwise, so that it is not automatically that just because this seizure or requisition has taken place that he has the right to reopen the assessment. The other amendment in section the reassessment provisions is that the extended time limit of 10 years from the end of the relevant assessment year for issue of the notice of reassessment applied in a situation where the assessing officer has in his possession books of accounts or other documents or evidence which reveal that income chargeable to tax represented in the form of asset which has escaped assessment amounts to or is likely to amount to rupees 50 lakh or more for that year. Now, asset, the term asset was not defined over there, and so they've now defined the term asset. It shall include, now this is an inclusive definition. What you need to understand is, it includes immobile property, being land or building of both, shares and securities, loans and advances, deposits in bank account, and it would also, of course, include other items which may fall under the definition of asset. And the whole objective here is to cover those search cases where they find some asset has been held, etc. So that seems to be the intention. And therefore, in such cases, this definition of asset really, it does not really, because without a definition also, what would have been the meaning of term asset? Perhaps, it would have been, it would definitely have covered these items. So that in any case, therefore, is something which will now be explicitly covered. A few of the other amendments which are there, and so one is this loss of exemption for PF interest or contribution exceeding 2,50,000 any year after 1st April 21. So if the provision was, the proposal was that if contribution in any year exceeds 2,50,000 by the employee exceeds 2,50,000, then he would lose the exemption for provident fund interest on such contribution in excess of 2,50,000. He would lose the benefit. Now they said that this limit would be 5 lakhs if the employer is not, if the contribution is being made in a fund in which there is no contribution by the employer. Now this seems to be true for central government employees, is what is reported, that central government employees in the provident fund, the government does not make a contribution, only the employee makes a contribution, and therefore such government employees, they can contribute up to 5 lakhs without having to pay interest on the PF interest. But private sector employees where the employer is contributing, there that limit still remains 2.5 lakhs. If he's contributing in excess of 2.5 lakhs, he will end up having to pay taxable interest on that. The small amendment in the tax audit provisions. Tax audit provision, that the limit has been enhanced from 5 crore to 10 crores in a case where the cash receipts or payments do not exceed 5% of the gross receipts or payments. Now they have provided that, when you mean cash receipt, even a payment or receipt by check or draft, which is other than account payee, that is, so, just like your 269, 269T, they refer to payments other than by account payee, check or demand draft. So here they're saying that, given it a fiction, saying that, okay, this will, other than by account payee, check or draft, will be regarded as a cash payment or cash receipt, and therefore, accordingly, you will have to apply the limits. Section 44 ADA, the presumptive scheme for professionals, there is an amendment, which is a small amendment. As earlier 44 ADA applied to all residents. Then the explanatory memorandum when this was brought in was referred to the residents who are uh, uh, individuals or individuals or partnership firm. That was the thing, and they realized that the drafting, there was a drafting mistake, and the provisions were applied to uh, everybody was claiming it, and therefore what they did is that they restricted it to only to the proposal was to restrict it to individual HUF partnership firm. The final this is that HUF has been removed. It's only an individual or partnership firm other than an LLP which qualifies. So basically an individual or a pure partnership firm. These are the only two which will qualify for 44 ADA. The time limit for belated and revised returns, there was a defective language. The language seemed to indicate that if you filed the return could be filed, belated return or a revised return could be filed only during the period from 1st of January to 31st of March. Whereas the intention was to say that it will to be filed on a date before the end of 3 months from the end of the financial assessment year. So now they have amended it. So therefore, it is 3 months before the end of the assessment year is what you got to file a belated or revised return. So for instance, for assessment year 21-22, assuming that there is no extension in dates, etc., as happened last year, your revised and belated returns can be filed only up to 31st of December. So that is the position. So that clarity is there. The 234F, which is a fee for default in filing of the return under section 139(1), that was 5,000 rupees if the return was filed before 31st December, and 10,000 in other cases, but it was limited to 1,000 rupees where the income was up to 5 lakh rupees. Now it is 5,000 rupees. The 10,000 rupees category has gone away. It is 5,000 rupees in all cases. Of course, subject to that limit of 1,000 rupees where the income is up to 5 lakh rupees. You have now a new section 234H where a fee would be payable of 1,000 rupees for delay in linking the PAN to the Aadhaar. The due date was 31st March. They've extended it to 30th June now. But if that is not done by 30th June, so therefore there would be a fee of 1,000 rupees which would be payable. Otherwise, obviously the return will not get accepted, etc. That's the. And on equalization levy, there are a couple of small changes. It was pointed out that at that point of time that in equalization levy on e-commerce purchase and sale of goods and services, say you had a situation where you booked a hotel room on, say, a foreign website, say booking.com. Now, booking.com is a foreign website. So therefore, it will be subject to, this levy of 2% on e-commerce operators. But suppose you book a hotel room, say in Lonavala for that matter. Now, Lonavala is in India. Booking.com would be paying the Indian hotel operator. And therefore, the question was, or there were goods which were sold by Amazon US, say for instance, sold some Indian goods to an Indian resident. Now, Amazon would end up having to pay equalization levy. So therefore, what they've done is for sale of goods or provision of services, which are the goods are owned by a person resident in India, or the services are provided by a person resident in India, or by a PE of a non-resident in India, if the goods or services are effectively connected with such PE. This will therefore no longer be governed by this, exclusion. So this will not be covered by equalization levy. This will not be subject to equalization levy. So therefore, booking.com will not levy equalization levy for if you book a hotel today. I mean, they will not have to pay equalization levy if you book a hotel in India. If you're booking a hotel abroad, then yes, they will charge equalization levy because they're selling online to an Indian resident, and that's the way it would happen. So similarly, if you buy goods which are manufactured by an Indian or which are owned by an Indian, a trader or an Indian manufacturer and who's supplying them, though you're booking it on a foreign website, still equalization levy would not apply to the foreign website. But in a situation where it's a foreign supplier, etc., it's only in those situations that this would apply now. So that is, I think, the amendments which I wanted to cover. Well, thank you for a patient hearing, and I think we have enough time for questions and answers.
Yeah, surely. Actually, in Q&A, we have only 2 questions. So,
yeah.
We have received 2 questions. The question is, if dissolution of firm happens on account of death of one partner and the asset shared equally between the legal heirs of deceased partner and surviving partner, what will be the capital gain impact?
I think, as I said, now look at it from this perspective, that so far as we'll have to look at first, let's look at section 9B. Section 9B applies to a situation of dissolution or reconstruction. So therefore 9B would apply in that situation. Now 9B, what would happen is that what are the capital assets given to a partner? Now it refers to a partner again. It doesn't refer to the legal heirs. So therefore in that situation, I think possibly there would be no capital gains impact in that situation. 45(4) will not apply at all because 45(4) does not apply to cases of dissolution at all. That's the way I would look at it. That's the way this seems to be, the position as of today. But as I said, there are lots of gaps because the way the first section was drafted was really bad. Second section is drafted, but there are still loopholes. There are still provisions which are there and which one would have to look at.
The second question is, what would be the position of NRI who does not and cannot have Aadhaar number?
See, this is a very interesting thing. Frankly speaking, I think, I get a lot of query from my NRI clients saying that, I'm getting this message that, you have to link your PAN to your Aadhaar, otherwise the PAN will become invalid and this, that. Now, if you look at the, the UIDAI Act, the Aadhaar, which is this act under which Aadhaar is allotted, a non-resident cannot apply for Aadhaar. He's not eligible to apply for Aadhaar. Now, how can you insist on, on linking a PAN to a Aadhaar to a person who's not eligible to apply for Aadhaar? How can you? Now, frankly speaking, I think it's the tax department which has not really, taken cognizance of this, and they should be telling banks and all that. Okay, non-residents are not eligible, required to link it, so that exemption should be provided. I think it's something which should be a provision which is there in the Act itself, that those persons who are not eligible to apply for Aadhaar, or who are not required to obtain Aadhaar, so they should be excluded completely. But that is unfortunately something which has not been done, and that is something which a problem which today one doesn't know that on 30th June, what horrors will happen, whether all these people PAN will become inactive, whether there will be a procedure for making them active without an Aadhaar again. I think this is something which the tax department needs to be clear about, and I think maybe the chamber should make a representation pointing this out in advance, so that NRIs don't find them. So suddenly one find it, we don't have a PAN and our bank account, we can't operate, we can't buy or sell shares, so that should not happen.
Second one is, can you please retake interplay of section 9B and 45(4)? It's not a question, it's about you to explain something again. Okay, we go to next question. How new partnership section will apply where there is a change in profit sharing ratio?
Yeah, so let's look at a situation where today, let me put it this way, that say today I am a 10% partner in the partnership firm. You are a 90% partner in the partnership firm. Now what happens is we decide to change and make me an equal partner. But you say that, okay, you bring in money into the firm, I will withdraw that money from the firm, and that's how we will the same. Now, in a situation where that happens, say for instance, there could be a goodwill created. For instance, it could be by way of creation of goodwill, a revaluation of assets. It could be a revaluation of assets. So whereby certain amount is this, and whereby I bring in certain money into the firm, and that other partner withdraws it from the firm. Now, earlier, under the existing law as of today, reconstitution by change of profit sharing was not covered at all by this. So therefore, that is a situation which will now be covered, so where the outgoing partner gets something, gets some money from the firm on account of the change in constitution of the firm.
And the next one is, in case you have already covered. So if one partner withdraw cash in partnership firm, irrespective of his capital account balance, if higher, compliance, or if low amount, compliance after withdrawing his capital balance goes to negative. Compliance, I didn't get this question.
The question is, I think, whether he's drawing more money than his capital balance. And yeah, so see, I'll tell you why 45(4) has come now. So let's understand, there are a series of decisions of the Bombay High Court in particular, and I think there was one or two other high courts also, where they said that if a partner receives on retirement from a partnership firm, he receives an amount in excess of his capital balance, that is not taxable, liable to tax at all. 45(4) did not apply there because it was the partnership firm which was liable, and that applied only if a capital asset was given to a partner on his retirement from the firm. If he was paid only money, it was not liable to tax at all. So we have a number of decisions. I think there was one Sheikh decision was there. There's this RB Wani's decision was there. There was Zoshi's decision. So there are a number of decisions of the Bombay High Court, and you can. I think we had covered it in controversy in BCA Journal a few months back. On this issue we had covered. Probably I don't know whether they read that, and that's why they thought that fit to tax it now. Because this controversy is that it's pending at least before the Supreme Court. I know in one matter that that is Hemlata Shetty's case, Bombay High Court decision. That issue is pending before the Supreme Court on this issue, same issue. Hemlata Shetty, Bombay High Court upheld that view. Riyaz Sheikh was the other decision, and so where you'll find in Riyaz Sheikh's decision, they've referred to all the earlier decisions also. Hemlata Shetty also, they've referred to all the earlier decisions. So that is what they wanted to tax. And therefore, if a partner is paid more than his capital balance, but in terms of money or in terms of a capital asset, because they must have thought that, okay, so far as stock in trade is concerned, anyway, the partnership firm is going to pay the tax on it as business profits. So therefore, no need to tax that. But so far as this is concerned, it will be liable to tax. That is seems to be.
Next question. Would a UAE resident consider to be liable to tax in her home country for the purpose of not being treated deemed resident in India?
Sorry?
Would a UAE resident consider to be liable to tax in her own home country for the purpose of not being treated deemed resident in India?
So you're looking at a person who's a resident of the UAE.
Yeah.
So the question is whether the person will be deemed to be resident in India is the question. Now, if the person under the India,
not being treated deemed resident in India.
Yeah. So the question is, person if you look at Section 61A, basically it says that so far as a citizen of India is concerned, a citizen of India will be deemed to be a resident in India if he is not liable to tax in any other country by virtue of his residence or domicile or any other criteria of a similar nature. So therefore, you have to look at it, is the person a resident of the UAE? And for the definition of resident of the UAE, firstly, look at the tax treaty. The tax treaty talks about 182 days or more in the UAE. Secondly, if one gets a tax residency certificate from the UAE from the UAE fiscal authorities, then one can say that one is a resident of the UAE, and therefore, you are a resident of the UAE by virtue of the fact that you are residing in the UAE for a certain number of days, and therefore you are not liable to tax in India. That deeming fiction does not apply to you. But in a situation where you are, say, in a country where, or you don't qualify as a resident of the UAE because you're in the UAE for less than 182 days, or the fiscal authorities of the UAE refuse to give you a certificate that you are a resident of the UAE, then you may have a problem so far as India is concerned, because you may be deemed to be a resident in India, but of course you'll be deemed to be resident, but not ordinary resident in India. So most people will not get affected because it will be only so far as investment income is concerned. If any investment income or employment income that they earn in the UAE will not be taxed in India. It will only be income of a business or profession controlled from India or a profession set up in India, which will be liable to tax in India, though it is carried on in the UAE. That's the.
Old age people do not get the Aadhaar because of biometric is not possible.
I know.
Yeah,
I had the same problem for my mother. Let me tell you, I had the same problem for my mother, and that was around 5 or 6 years back, and she was 80 at that time. And frankly speaking, what we did is first we said, okay, forget it. It is optional, so we had left it like that. Then finally we said that no, now this is becoming a problem everywhere. You need the Aadhaar and all that. And finally we took her to a place where they were able to capture the partial Aadhaar or whatever. They said that, okay, this is sufficient. And on that basis, they have granted Aadhaar. So the fingerprints may not be clear because, they become flattened out over as you age, so that's where, so the fingerprints are not captured, but other things have been captured and the iris, etc. So therefore, on that basis, they have given Aadhaar.
On the basis of retina scan, they give the Aadhaar. So
Correct.
if there are old people whose fingerprints are not, coming onto that screen, then they'll give it on the basis of the iris scan.
Correct.
But you have to go to a proper center to get it done.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Best thing is go to a post office, they'll do it properly.
I see.
Next question is, in case reassessment provisions for the period beyond 3 years in escape representing assets, whether assets on the date of income earned or at the concerned year end or at the time of invoking provision of section 147. Please
See,
enlighten.
I think, the whole objective is, to cover search cases. So in search cases, they find that you have an asset somewhere or you had an asset somewhere. And I think, so long as that asset was existing at any point of time, it's not that that asset should be existing as on the date of search. So that is one aspect of it. That the question is, so if there was an asset in existence, say there was an inmovable property which was owned by you at that point of time, and you subsequently sold it, you've not reflected the property anyway in your tax record, then possibly I think so it need not be existing as of the date of search or as of the date of issue of notice of reassessment. That's I think the the way probably it will be looked at finally, because what is the intention? But there could be another situation. Now, let's take a case of a foreign company, say which has claimed say benefit of the Mauritius tax treaty, etc. It has sold the shares and it has earned capital gains. Now, those shares were official. This thing, they were not something which was undisclosed asset. But when it sold capital gains, it has got a bank balance. It has not received money. So can they say that this is assets represented in the form of money? I think it's a open question whether that sort of intent is intended to be covered. But what is clearly not intended to be covered is a situation where, say, you claim certain expenditure. You claimed certain expenditure, which is, say, in earlier years, you claimed CSR expenditure, which at that point of time, CS before the amendment came to 37(1), at that point of time, and the department feels that no, in those years also CSR expenditure is not allowable. Now that CSR expenditure, to disallow that they cannot do because it is not represented in the form of an asset. So expenditure for expenditure purposes, they cannot apply the provision for reassessment. It will only be 3 years. It will not go to 10 years. So that is the good part. But so far as this asset is, it's an open question as to how courts will read it down. So that's something which one will have to look at.
Second question is, constitutional validity of taxing income of a partner in the hand of firms.
So what is a partnership firm? A partnership firm is a compendium. I'm not a constitutional expert. First, let me clarify. So this is something which you'll have to ask Mr. Datar or some lawyer who specializes in constitutional law. So far as this is concerned, what is a partnership firm? Partnership firm is a compendium of all the partners. It's only for tax purposes. That is artificially, it's the firm which is taxed or the partner who's taxed. Now, you had a scheme earlier where the firm's income was taxed, and then the firm paid registered firm tax. Then the share of profit was divided amongst partners, and partners again paid tax on it. Then this was replaced by the present scheme where on part of the income the firm pays tax, on part of the income the partners pay tax. Now, so that is merely a means of apportionment of who pays the tax. So I don't think, constitutional validity, I doubt whether, frankly speaking, whether that is something which may come up, frankly speaking. I don't think that would.
I don't think in law they will look at a partnership as being different from the partners, because ultimately partnership is not a separate legal entity in that sense.
Correct. The only thing is, it does result in some inequity. Let's take a partner who is retired. Now the firm pays the tax, and therefore it's the continuing partners who bear the brunt of that tax. Though the retiring partner has got the benefit. That's unfair. The law is unfair.
It's a commercial arrangement, na, Gautam.
Absolutely.
Nobody
It's
is going to
unfair.
go out of pocket. So they will,
absolutely.
do the whatever netting off, right?
Correct.
When they pay in.
Absolutely.
So we will take up last two questions. Partnership firm is dissolved and one of the partner is received property which is held under tenancy right. How gain is to be calculated?
See, this is the question is tenancy rights a capital asset? And the question here really does arise as to, can one attribute certain value to those tenancy rights? See, firstly, let me also point out to you, there is one, the question is whether tenancy rights can go to a partner.
Yeah.
Is a question mark.
Yeah.
Because unless that partner was a partner at the point of time when the firm was granted the tenancy rights, the view in law is that the tenancy rights cannot go to another partner who was not a partner at the point of time that the firm was given the tenancy rights. So when the tenancy was created. So therefore, if the tenancy was created, say 70 years back, and today a partner who was just joined maybe 10 years back or 20 years back is given the tenancy rights. Firstly, the question is, do those tenancy rights go to him at all? Is a question mark, which you need to this. And secondly, then let's look at the provisions of Section 9B. Would so far as 9B is concerned, can one invoke the provisions of Section 9B at all? Okay, one can say that he has received a capital asset, but it's taxable to charge under the head capital gains. So therefore, fair market value is to be taken as this thing. And of course, there is this thing that the board can. How do you determine the fair market value? Then that's the question. And therefore, we'll have to wait and see what the rules bring. Rather not the rules, because here we say that it's not the rules. It will be the fair market value means if it can be sold in the open market. What is the price which can be sold in the open market? Now, tenancy is not something which you can sell in the open market, and therefore, if you apply 222B, I think the value of the tenancy rights would be nil. Frankly speaking, I think that seems to be the position. And when it comes to Section 45(4), the question here again is because it's a capital asset, the tenancy rights, one will now. Therefore, what is the amount? Again, there the amount is the fair market value of the capital asset, which is the amount of fair market value of the capital receipt of the capital asset received by such person. And the question there is again, how does one compute that? This is the question. And if it takes you, because there is again no prescription which is said so far as the fair market value is concerned over there. Both these provisions don't have required you to go to the rules, and therefore again, if one looks at 222B, then in that situation, what is the fair market value of the tenancy? I would say it's nil again, because tenancy is not something which can be assigned. It's not capable of being assigned.
Yeah. So last question. If partner withdraws more than his capital balance and excess amount remains as loan in a firm, whether capital gain applicable?
You're saying on retirement, this amount is, but so long as the deed does not provide that this amount is paid to him. So if it is given to extra amount is withdrawn by him and it is repayable by him to the firm, then in that situation, I don't think it can be taxed. But subsequently, if the firm writes it off, then maybe there could be a reassessment of the earlier year.